It's July 13th, 2026, and the Strait of Hormuz just became the site of a genuine first in American military history. Over the weekend, United States forces used armed sea drones in actual combat for the first time ever, striking a submarine and ship maintenance facility at Iran's Bandar Abbas naval base. This wasn't a test, a demonstration, or a leaked prototype video. This was Central Command on the record, announcing that unmanned surface vessels had been used to hit a hostile target under live combat conditions. To understand why that matters and where this is likely headed, we need to walk through what's actually happened, what's confirmed, and what's still speculation dressed up as fact, and a lot of the coverage circulating online. Let's start with the timeline, because the war itself didn't begin this weekend. This conflict between the United States and Iran has been running since late February of 2026, when hostilities first broke out. Over the months that followed, there were periods of intense strikes, periods of relative calm, and eventually a negotiated interim peace agreement, a memorandum of understanding that both sides signed after roughly 60 days of talks. That agreement was supposed to be the off-ramp. It was designed to de-escalate the shooting war and, critically, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to normal commercial traffic. For anyone unfamiliar with why that patch of water matters so much, the Strait of Hormuz is the narrow channel between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula that connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. Roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil supply moves through that strait. It is arguably the single most important choke point in global energy trade. Any disruption there doesn't just affect the region. It ripples through oil markets, shipping insurance rates, and ultimately prices at the pump on the other side of the planet. The trouble started when interpretations of that memorandum diverged sharply. Iran's parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, had initially signaled agreement with the terms, but then walked that back, framing Iran's role as one of escorting ships through the strait. In practice, according to reporting on the ground, Iran's version of escorting ships involved the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps using Shahed-type drones against vessels that didn't follow routes Tehran dictated, including strikes on ships' bridges and engine rooms that put mariners' lives directly at risk. From the American and Allied perspective, this wasn't escort, it was extortion dressed up in the language of maritime security. Iran wanted de facto control over a fifth of the world's oil traffic and was willing to use force against civilian shipping to enforce it. That disagreement is what caused the ceasefire to unravel. President Trump said publicly that he believed the truce was over, and within days the United States had resumed and then dramatically escalated its strike campaign. Reporting indicates that over a single week, American forces hit somewhere in the range of 90 to 140 Iranian military sites in a series of overnight assaults, concentrated heavily along Iran's coastline facing the strait. These were not scattered, symbolic strikes. Targets included air defense systems, coastal radar installations, missile and drone launch sites, and naval assets, specifically the small, fast attack boats the IRGC has used for years to harass and, at times, attack commercial and military vessels transiting the strait. By the time the fourth consecutive wave of strikes wrapped up on July 12th, U.S. Central Command said American forces had struck more than 300 targets inside Iran since this most recent escalation began. Iran did not sit still through any of this. In a pattern we've now seen repeat across multiple rounds, Iranian forces responded to American strikes with barrages of their own, launching drones and missiles at U.S. military installations and at Gulf allies hosting American forces, including bases in Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, Oman, and Qatar. Kuwait reported damage to border posts and an offshore drilling rig from drone strikes. Qatar reported injuries, including a child, from intercepted drones. Jordan reported missiles landing within its territory with limited damage and no casualties. The UAE detected incoming threats, but reported no missiles actually reaching its territory. Sirens sounded repeatedly across Bahrain as the country braced for successive nights of attacks. This is important context, because whatever the strategic merits of the American campaign, ordinary civilians across multiple Gulf states have been living through actual air raid sirens and actual explosions as this standoff plays out. Now to the piece that's genuinely historic, the sea drones. On July 12th, U.S. Central Command confirmed that American forces used one-way attack surface drones in combat for the first time. Specifically, 3 Corsair unmanned surface vessels struck the submarine and ship maintenance facility at Bandar Abbas. These are not experimental toys. The Corsair is built by a company called Saronic, and it's a 24-foot unmanned surface vessel with a range of more than 1,000 nautical miles, a payload capacity of around 1,000 pounds, and a top speed of roughly 35 knots. According to Saronic, the platform runs on an embedded AI stack with an open architecture designed to integrate sensors and autonomy software quickly, which makes it flexible across a range of missions from surveillance to, as we now know, one-way strike missions. The Navy has actually been fielding Corsair vessels in the region since around March of this year under Task Force 59, part of the Navy's broader push to integrate unmanned systems into Middle East maritime operations. In fact, a Corsair vessel had already made headlines just last month in a very different context. It helped rescue 2 U.S. Army soldiers after their Apache helicopter went down near the Strait of Hormuz. So this is a platform that's been quietly proving itself in the theater for months before this weekend's strike mission. What changed this weekend is the mission profile, moving from reconnaissance and rescue support to actual one-way attack strikes against a fixed target. It's worth pausing on why this matters strategically, not just symbolically. Iran's coastal defense posture in the Strait has long relied on dispersing small, fast boats and hardened coastal facilities that are difficult and risky to target with manned aircraft or larger naval vessels, particularly in the narrow, congested waters of the Strait itself. Sending a manned ship or aircraft into that environment carries real risk to American personnel. An autonomous surface vessel, expendable by design, changes that calculus. You can send a relatively low-cost drone boat directly at a hardened target without putting a sailor's life on the line. And if it's intercepted or destroyed in the process, you've lost hardware, not people. This is precisely the logic that's driven Ukraine's naval drone campaign against Russia's Black Sea Fleet over the past few years, where relatively cheap, uncrewed boats packed with explosives have managed to damage or sink Russian vessels, force the Black Sea Fleet to relocate assets, and generally erode Russian naval dominance in that theater at a fraction of the cost of traditional naval warfare. The Pentagon has clearly been watching that playbook closely, and this weekend's strike on Bandar Abbas looks like the American military applying a very similar concept in a very different theater. It's also worth being precise about what we actually know regarding the broader drone picture, because a lot of commentary online has blurred confirmed reporting with speculation. What's confirmed? The Corsair strike on Bandar Abbas, built by Saronic. What's also confirmed separately is that earlier in this conflict, back in February, U.S. forces began using low-cost one-way attack aerial drones explicitly modeled on Iran's own Shahed drones, the same airframes that have become notorious for their use by Russia against Ukrainian cities. Central Command has been fairly open about this, essentially saying that these inexpensive, Shahid-inspired American drones are now delivering American-made responses back at the same kind of threat. Beyond that, there's been chatter online about additional undersea drone systems and other next-generation platforms potentially in play, but those specific claims haven't been confirmed by Central Command or any verified defense reporting, so it's worth treating them with real skepticism rather than presenting them as established fact. When the actual capability is this genuinely significant, a first-ever combat use of an armed sea drone, there's no need to embellish it with unconfirmed claims about secret submarine drones. The confirmed reality is dramatic enough on its own. Let's talk about the political dimension, because this is where things get genuinely contentious and where accuracy matters most. President Trump, addressing Iran's claims that it had closed the Strait of Hormuz, dismissed those claims directly, saying Iran had nothing to back them up. He went further, indicating the United States intended to essentially take over management of the strait going forward, describing the U.S. as becoming something like the guardian of the waterway. He also floated the idea that the United States should be compensated for providing that security, framing decades of prior U.S. naval presence protecting shipping lanes as an unpaid service that should now come with a fee attached, reportedly floated as something like a 20% charge on cargo passing through. This is a genuinely novel and controversial position. The Strait of Hormuz operates under the international principle of transit passage, which, as a matter of established maritime law, does not permit states to charge vessels simply for passing through international waters. Analysts covering the story have noted that any American or Allied attempt to impose transit fees would sit in a legally uncertain space, and that even Oman, which has been engaged in separate talks with Iran about a new maritime security arrangement, would face real legal constraints if it tried to impose service fees of its own. So whatever the political rhetoric, actually implementing a toll on the strait is far from straightforward, and it's likely to draw legal and diplomatic pushback from multiple directions, including from allies who rely on that waterway just as much as adversaries do. Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for its part, condemned the American strikes as a serious threat to international peace and security, and argued that months of diplomatic effort toward de-escalation have effectively been rendered meaningless by the resumption of large-scale attacks. Iran has also accused the United States of pressuring Oman behind the scenes to prevent a workable arrangement from emerging out of talks in Muscat. Whatever one's view of Iran's underlying conduct in the Strait, including the attacks on commercial shipping that precipitated this latest escalation, it's worth acknowledging that both sides are now locked into dueling narratives, each portraying the other as the party that broke the peace. That's a familiar pattern in prolonged conflicts, and it tends to make off-ramps harder to find the longer it persists. Markets have already responded. Oil prices jumped meaningfully as this latest cycle of strikes and counterstrikes unfolded. with Brent crude rising toward the high 70s per barrel amid renewed fears that a fifth of the world's oil supply could face sustained disruption. Stock futures in the U.S. slipped, and markets in Asia, including a sharp drop in South Korea's Kospi index, reflected just how sensitive global markets remain to any sign of prolonged instability around the strait. Shipping tracking data has shown traffic through the strait reduced to a trickle during the periods of heaviest fighting, even as the U.S. and Iran continue to publicly dispute whether the waterway is actually closed. This is the part of the story that reaches well beyond military analysts and defense reporters. Everyone who buys gasoline, everyone whose retirement account holds energy stocks, everyone in a country that imports oil through that strait has a direct stake in how this resolves. Separately, and importantly not connected to any of the combat operations in the region, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina passed away this past weekend at the age of 71, following what his office described as a brief and sudden illness. Preliminary medical findings point to an aortic dissection as the cause of death, a serious cardiovascular event that can occur with little to no warning, even in people who don't have an obvious prior diagnosis. Graham had served in the Senate for 23 years and had built a reputation over decades in politics as one of the more hawkish voices on defense and foreign policy in Washington, someone closely associated with support for a muscular American posture abroad, including strong backing for Ukraine and a firm line against Iran. He had reportedly just returned from a trip to Ukraine before his death. President Trump and other officials from across the political spectrum offered tributes following the news. His passing has also kicked off an immediate and consequential political scramble, since it effectively narrows the Senate Republican majority and puts pressure on South Carolina and national GOP leadership to identify a successor ahead of the midterm elections. It's a significant loss, regardless of where anyone stands politically, and it's a reminder that major news cycles rarely happen in isolation. The Iran conflict and Graham's death are unfolding simultaneously and are being covered side by side, but they are not causally connected events, and it's worth being careful about conflating them just because they broke in the same news cycle. So where does this actually go from here? A few things seem worth watching closely. First, whether the introduction of armed sea drones changes Iran's calculus around using its fast attack boats in the strait. If Iranian naval commanders now have to assume that any port facility, any maintenance yard, any docked vessel could be struck by a low-cost autonomous boat that's extremely difficult to intercept before impact, that could meaningfully alter how aggressively they're willing to operate in and around the strait going forward. Second, whether the diplomatic track survives this at all. The interim peace agreement from a couple of months ago collapsed once its interpretation became contested, and rebuilding trust after multiple rounds of strikes and counterstrikes is a much harder proposition than it was before shots were fired. Third, the economic angle deserves close attention independent of the military details, because sustained instability in the strait, even short of a full closure, tends to keep a persistent risk premium baked into oil prices, and that has knock-on effects for inflation and economic growth well beyond the Middle East. Fourth, the legal and diplomatic fight over any proposed transit fee or expanded American security role in the strait is likely to become its own story, separate from the shooting war, involving allies, international maritime law, and questions about who actually has the authority to regulate passage through what is legally recognized as an international waterway, rather than the sovereign territory of any one state. It's also worth stepping back and thinking about what this weekend represents in the broader arc of military technology. For years now, defense analysts have talked about the way cheap, expendable autonomous systems are reshaping conflicts that used to be dominated entirely by expensive, exquisite manned platforms. Ukraine showed the world what a swarm of relatively inexpensive sea drones could do against a much larger conventional navy. Now the United States has demonstrated the same basic concept, applied with its own considerably larger resources and more advanced autonomy software, against Iranian naval infrastructure in one of the most strategically sensitive waterways on Earth. Whatever happens politically and diplomatically from here, that technological shift looks like it's now permanently part of how this kind of conflict gets fought, not just in Ukraine's coastal waters, but in the Persian Gulf, and probably in other contested waterways in the years ahead. None of this changes the human stakes involved. Civilians in Gulf states have spent consecutive nights under air raid sirens. Mariners on commercial vessels have had to navigate an increasingly dangerous transit corridor, with real attacks on ships' bridges and engine rooms putting actual lives at risk, not just cargo. Iranian civilians have been affected by strikes on infrastructure near populated areas, with state media reporting casualties from some of the American strikes. This is a live, ongoing conflict with real consequences for real people on multiple sides, not simply an abstract contest of hardware and strategy, even though the hardware and strategy are genuinely fascinating and genuinely unprecedented in some respects. If you're trying to make sense of a story like this as it develops in real time, a few habits are worth keeping in mind. Confirmed statements from an official body like Central Command carry more weight than anonymous claims circulating on social media about secret platforms or classified programs. Specific numbers, like the number of targets struck or the specifications of a particular drone, are worth checking against multiple independent outlets rather than taking any single source at face value, especially in a fast-moving conflict where early reports often get revised. And it's worth being skeptical of any single narrative, whether it paints one side as purely righteous and the other as purely villainous, since conflicts of this scale and complexity almost never break down that cleanly, and the people most confidently pushing the simplest version of the story are often the ones with the least direct knowledge of what's actually happening on the ground. What we can say with confidence, based on verified reporting, is this. The war between the United States and Iran, which began in February of 2026, saw a serious escalation over the past week, after a fragile interim peace agreement broke down over disputes about control of the Strait of Hormuz. American forces conducted multiple waves of strikes against Iranian military targets, ultimately hitting more than 300 sites, while Iran responded with drone and missile attacks against American bases across several Gulf states. On July 12th, USUC, forces used armed unmanned surface vessels, specifically Saronic-built Corsair drones, in combat for the first time in American military history, striking a naval facility at Bandar Abbas. President Trump has signaled an intention for the United States to take a more permanent security role in the strait going forward, a position that raises real legal and diplomatic questions, given the international rules governing passage through the waterway. Oil markets have reacted with real volatility given the strait's outsized role in global energy trade. And separately, Senator Lindsey Graham's sudden death this weekend has reshaped the political landscape in Washington heading into the midterms, even as it remains unrelated to the military events unfolding half a world away. This is a story that's still very much unfolding, and the next several days are likely to bring further developments on both the military and diplomatic fronts. Whether the sea drone strikes mark the beginning of a new, sustained phase of unmanned naval warfare in the Gulf, or whether they end up being a one-time demonstration ahead of renewed negotiations, is genuinely an open question right now, and it's one worth watching closely rather than assuming an answer in either direction before the facts are in.